The Australian Financial Review.
Everyone agrees Australia needs more houses, but not everyone agrees on where to put them. The latest standoff is happening in a wealthy suburb in Sydney's east. Residents in Woollahra have pushed back on a proposal to revive a ghost train station and triple the number of houses in the area. But political leaders are standing firm, amid concern there are many more Woollahras around the country.
And we need to really stare down these NIMBY movements which are saying, oh yes, we're very concerned about housing, but just not in my backyard. It just can't continue.
Federal Housing Minister Claire O'Neill says we need to build houses where people want to live.
We've been there talking to their kids in their teens or their 20s about their housing aspirations. This is directly linked to the willingness of communities around the country to accept more density. It has to happen.
NIMBYism is not the only reason Australia will fail to meet its target of building 1.2 million homes in 5 years. And there is an increasing sense of urgency.
I think the housing crisis has got to the point now where sending concrete trucks in to ruin, a beautiful tree-lined inner east Sydney has never been politically easier to do.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, New South Wales political correspondent Paul Karp and Deputy Property Editor Michael Bleby on the political leaders declaring war on NIMBYs, whether it will help the country meet its housing supply target, and why the bigger problem might be a tradie deficit. It's Thursday, September 11. Hi, Michael. Hi, Paul. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Lisa.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Michael, the housing crisis touches every major policy debate in the country, from immigration to intergenerational equity to tax reform. The government has set a 5-year target for the building of new homes, but we're not going to get there. They've said that already. Can you explain the numbers? How many houses are we building and how many should we be building?
National Cabinet set this target 2 years ago to build 1.2 million homes in 5 years. That's partly because we just don't have enough housing in this country. We now have an affordability problem where an average home is more than $1 million, which is 10 times the average annual full-time income of Australians. That's too big a problem for any politician to ignore. But how do we get there?
Today in our nation, housing is a life-defining issue for millions of Australians.
Last week at the Financial Review Property Summit, Housing Minister Claire O'Neill went to some effort to say that 1.2 million home figure was an aspirational target.
An aspirational target. So we've got a national aspiration. The aspiration, anyone who's driven towards a big goal knows that it's really important for us to be aspirational.
Now, when she said that, she was just acknowledging what everybody had been saying for a long time, that we wouldn't get to that number. The federal government's own housing advisory body, in May, I think it was, put a realistic target of 938,000 homes over that 5-year period. So a fair way short of the 1.2 million target. But even so, last week at the Property Summit, everybody agreed that it was good to have a national target that we should at least be aiming to achieve. And Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz, the former head of property development company Mirvac, who now heads the federal government's National Housing Supply and Affordability Council.
And even if we built 1.2 million, we don't go anywhere near addressing the already embedded undersupply in the market. So
said at the summit that the target wasn't a magic number.
It's a random number, effectively, galvanising for sure.
The Master Builders Association, which is one of the large industry associations, is a bit more optimistic than the government's most recent forecasts. They say that we'll get to just over 1 million homes over the 5-year period. But that's still a shortfall of 36,000 homes a year on what we need. This is going to be a big thing to change to speed up the volume of housing. Under the latest forecasts from the federal government's National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, most states are going to fall way short of their own share of that 1.2 million home target. Surprisingly, perhaps, Victoria is the only state which is going to come close to that number. It's a state where the housing market has been in decline for a couple of years already. Prices have been falling, and there hasn't been a lot of new building going on. So consequently, there's a lot of capacity in the construction sector to build these new homes. Land is cheaper and more available. And the fact that housing prices have come off a fair extent means that a larger number of people can actually afford to buy a new house in the first place, which isn't the case in a lot of other states and territories.
So, Paul, as the high-profile dispute over a development in the wealthy suburb of Woollahra shows you, the obstacles in meeting the target are huge. You've been reporting on this increasingly heated standoff in Woollahra, which is emblematic of the obstacles to boosting housing supply across the country. For those listeners who don't live in Sydney, explain where Woollahra is, who lives there, and why it has become ground zero in the housing crisis.
Okay, so Woollahra is a well-to-do, established suburb in Sydney's inner east. It's about 5 kilometres away from the city. The area is full of big mansions on large blocks, young professionals in the apartments, people that have really made it in the mansions. And it's a who's who. You know, you've got property developers like Brett Levy. The late Carla Zampatti lived in this area, and her daughter is the independent MP for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, you know, the former Vogue editor Edwina McCann. So it's a very well-to-do area. And this idea of changing this part of Sydney the government has been working on it in the background, looking at what sort of uplift they could get from declaring it a transport-oriented development zone. But what really set this running is the decision in May of the Australian Turf Club to reject the proposed sale of the Rosehill Racecourse, which was going to be turned into a mini city with 25,000 dwellings. But before the vote went down, Chris Minns, the New South Wales Premier, said, look, there is a plan B.
So Woollahra was plan B?
One of many, and it has the benefit of the fact that a metro station at Homebush and Bays West in Balmain costs a couple of billion, but it only costs a few $100 million to put a train station on an existing train line, and that's Woollahra.
A major housing development is on the horizon for Sydney.
10,000 new homes and a new train station.
It's where you'll find millionaires row upon row surrounding a ghost station.
And despite critics, the Premier says it's full steam ahead.
This is a ghost train station, all carved out, ready, exactly the right size to put a platform, about 90 seconds in either direction on the line to Edgecliff or Bondi Junction, so much so that on the Sunday when we were called there for the press conference, the ministers and the Premier would have to pause for the trains to be rushing through as they were giving their answers.
So take us back to the day it was announced and explain exactly what the proposal is and what the reaction was that day.
Yeah, so it was on a sunny Sunday morning, late winter. The press pack assembled with Chris Minns, Housing Minister Rose Jackson, Planning Minister Paul Scully, mansions on one side, a steep residential street that allows a view down onto where the platform will be built. As the press pack was there asking questions, residents were walking past, having read the morning's paper and seen that this was going to be announced.
I've lived here for about 40 years because I like it the way it is.
I don't object to development, but it has to be sensible and well considered.
As we finished the press conference, neighbours had gathered in their front yards on the street to discuss this plan. It was already causing controversy.
Love the idea of getting a station here, but 10,000 dwellings, how many cars, where are they going to park?
Well, not trying to be a snob or anything, but there'd be a probably different style of person than what lives here now, and this place is a village.
Some of those people were sufficiently exercised to, in one case, chase Paul Scully, the planning minister, up the street.
Yeah, we'll kick off the process, right, and there will be opportunities for community consultation along the way.
To ask about lack of consultation and when were we going to be told about this, to which his answer was, well, we're telling you now, pretty much.
So we'd get some
communication from?
Yeah, well, this is the first part of the communication, right?
Me chasing you down the road.
No, but making the decision public. You can't kick off a process without telling people that the process is going to start.
It was a good opportunity to be able to talk to people that were stopping to look at the station and ask how they would feel about how much it would change the area.
And Paul, what are the opponents and supporters of this Woollahra proposal? What are their main arguments?
Well, the supporters, the main argument is, Sydney's the second most expensive real estate market in the world. This is very close to the CBD. It's on an existing train line, and once the station's complete, it will have the infrastructure to support a bigger population. Woollahra's population has actually gone backwards, which makes it a sort of symptomatic example of the city with no grandchildren, that spectre that the New South Wales government raises, the thing that they're trying to fight against, that the population isn't replacing itself in some of these older established suburbs. The opponents of it basically point to the fact that the train station isn't needed because of how short a walk it is to either Bondi Junction or Edgecliff. And, yes, that every area has to get more dense, but the number 10,000 seems either too much, because that would be a tripling of the 5,000 existing dwellings in Woollahra and Edgecliff. So either too much or just arbitrary. Where did that come from is one of the most common responses you get.
And is another argument that if we're trying to address the issue of housing affordability, building a whole lot of apartments in one of Australia's wealthiest suburbs is not the way to do it, because the cost of those apartments would be a lot more than, say, even the apartments in the Rose Hill development or other parts of New South Wales?
Yeah, so only up to 10% of the dwellings are going to be affordable housing. And for the rest, you're looking at $2, $3, $4 million for an apartment. So in no sense affordable. But I think what that argument misses is that really supply is the only solution, and you need more supply of housing at all points, the expensive end, the medium end, and the less expensive end of the market. So no, the people that missed out on living in Rose Hill are probably not going to be the people that are able to spend $3 million on an apartment in Woollahra. But the New South Wales government says, well, there's 15,000 homes going in around Burwood. There are a lot of places that we're going to be building, not just Woollahra.
And Michael, this NIMBYism, or this not in my backyardism in Woollahra, is emblematic of debates raging across the country, isn't it?
It would be great if we could say it was just a Woollahra thing, but it's very much not. It's a national obsession. Victoria has its own housing densification policy and has set out 60 areas across Greater Melbourne that it's designated as activity centres with the aim of building 300,000 more homes by 2051. One of these centres is Brighton in Melbourne's leafy Bayside suburbs. And last October, Premier Jacinta Allen faced her own questions from locals when on a Sunday morning she went to announce Brighton as one of the locations for this activity centre and got quite a hostile response. But there's a Woollahra in every state. Melbourne has Brighton, other cities have their own suburbs, and these are just two places that are emblematic of the challenges for policymakers in every state.
But Michael, it feels like politicians are increasingly more prepared to stand up to NIMBYs and to powerful local councils in getting these developments through. We increasingly hear how approvals are one of the biggest stumbling blocks to housing supply and to our attempts to meet the housing target. Are political leaders fighting back against difficult councils? Do you think this is starting to have an impact?
Housing and our use of land has become more complex. We need to fit more people into the same space, and at the same time, the standards of what we expect from our homes and the need to do it more sustainably is putting greater burdens on how complex things are. And that means we have tighter rules than we had 40 years ago or even 10 years ago. But Australia's never been good at thinking about regulatory burdens in a holistic way, and particularly not when those burdens are imposed by three different tiers of government, those being the federal government, state government and local councils. Councils are very powerful and have played a big role in calling the shots. Master Builders Australia says that completion times for detached houses have blown out from between 6 and 9 months to between 12 and 15 months, and high-rise apartments can take up to 4 years to deliver, up from 3 years before. At the federal government level alone, the quantum of houses needing federal government heritage and environmental approval through a system called the EPBC Act is now at a total of 78,000 homes. Now, not all of these are just awaiting a tick from the federal government. Some of them have gone back to the developers for more information. But last month at the Economic Roundtable, the federal government and other policymakers agreed to try and speed up the approval or assessment of some 26,000 of those home applications that were just sitting there waiting for assessment. And that alone would have some effect in speeding up the system.
For so long, the planning system has put the control in the local council's hands, and they assess developments to try and make them as locally appropriate as possible. And often that means hearing complaints from local residents that don't want their area to change, and then downscaling the ambition of that development, putting in procedural roadblocks that take longer to get something built. But now state governments are approaching this with the idea of how do we take the biggest bite out of the housing crisis? How do we increase the capacity of this area to host people to live? And then that means state government overriding local government. And you still see that strength of passion of local residents that don't want change, but now they're on the losing end of the argument because the state government is using their powers to overrule them. And so they've brought to this a huge arsenal of anti-NIMBY policies in New South Wales. It's the mid-rise policy, which allows up to 6-storey apartment blocks to be built. It's the Housing Delivery Authority, which makes recommendations for projects to be state significant, which then bypasses councils. It's the transport-oriented development zone, of which, Woollahra and Edgecliff are examples, upzoning around public transport.
But all that proposed development needs workers, electricians, bricklayers, tradespeople, and we keep hearing that there's a chronic labour shortage. How big a problem is the lack of tradies?
We're absolutely suffering from labour shortages of skilled workers. At the Property Summit, Nigel Satterley, who is a land developer based in Perth, but who operates in Victoria, Western Australia and Queensland, left everybody stunned when he pointed out that on some projects, if you have a team of 4, say, bricklayers, you might have the leader of that team earning $500,000 a year and his 3 colleagues or her 3 colleagues earning $250K. These are huge sums of money that are being paid, and that's a reflection of the fact that we just don't have enough of these people.
And how much do Australia's immigration policy settings play into this? Many in the industry complain there's just not enough skilled labour coming into the country.
It is a difficult one because on the one hand, immigration increases demand for housing at a time when prices are already very high. But on the other, is the supply of skilled labour that then helps you alleviate the capacity constraints and to solve the problem.
And in part, a lot of our problems are homegrown. Yes, we haven't been training enough people with these skills, but amongst the narrow pool that we have, a lot of those people are also being sucked away into higher paying infrastructure jobs. We've got large road, rail and other projects taking place across the country. They need these skills, not necessarily bricklayers per se, but concreters, electricians, all the sorts of trades that we need in developing the infrastructure of housing. So we need more of them. But also, we're shooting ourselves in the foot a bit. Again, it comes back to the fact that Australia is a federation. And every state and territory has its own processes for managing and for regulating skills, particularly when it comes to the housing market. It would be a whole lot easier if we could have national systems for registration and for qualification for these trades that could be applied across different states and territories, so that if you're trying to move a brickie from one state to another, if you're trying to move a plumber, you can do it, and the registration they have in one place is acceptable and understood in another.
So the housing crisis is a huge political issue people are feeling it in the rents that they're paying and in the cost of buying to get into the market. And everyone is concerned about missing that 1.2 million target. I've reported on some YouGov polling that is of concern no matter who you vote for. But I think the really interesting thing and why it's such a burning political issue is that what to do about it is something that people have different views on, and that can differ depending on who you vote for.
Paul, we're talking about the housing crisis. Australia is going to fall short of the 1.2 million homes it needs to build in the 5 years to 2029. This is a problem that, as you've discovered from the polling you looked at, resonates across the political spectrum. No matter who you vote for, you are concerned about this issue. But where the difference is how people want to respond to that. So how is this changing the way politicians appeal to voters?
So dwellings don't vote, people do. But when you talk to political strategists like Cos Samaras, they say, well, it may as well be the dwelling voting, because if you have a certain type of housing, like apartments, that's affordable and attractive to a certain sort of person, like young professionals who don't yet have kids, then that has an impact on voting patterns as well. So younger people are going more for high density, and that can influence voting patterns to be more towards the progressive side of politics, Labor, Greens or Teal independents. The YouGov poll I mentioned before the break shows that those voters are much more likely to hear that we're missing the target and to respond by saying we should do more to meet it. Whereas voters of conservative parties, it's still the more popular response to say do more, but they're more likely to say maybe we should abandon the target.
We're absolutely seeing renting becoming a political force in a way that it wasn't before. There was an example of this in the 2022 election that brought Labor to power in the Melbourne seat of Kooyong. ABS figures from the 2021 census show that 29% of households in Kooyong were renters. That was just larger than the 28.5% seen across Victoria as a whole. And a number of commentators said the growing number of renters in that electorate of people who knew how hard it was going to be to get into the home ownership game was one of the contributing factors to the defeat of the sitting Liberal Party member who was the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Fast forward to 2025, to the election earlier this year. The Liberal candidate who was trying to wrest the seat back from the Teal independent, Monique Ryan, pitched herself as a renter, saying that she was a young person who knew the struggles of renting and was also very much one of these growing cohorts of millennial renters. Now, that pitch fell a bit flat when it was revealed that she also owned two investment properties, one in London and one in Canberra. But it made clear the point that the parties realise renters are now a political force that they need to appeal to in a way that they didn't before.
Michael, we recently had the Economic Roundtable, and there were a few initiatives to address the housing supply shortfall that came out of that. Tell us what they were, and do you think they'll make a difference?
A few things came out of the Economic Reform Roundtable. There was the federal government pledge to speed up assessment of the 26,000 home applications that we discussed earlier. Another issue was the announcement that they would freeze updates in something called the National Construction Code. This is kind of a national recipe book or a blueprint for the way buildings, have to be built in this country. Every state and territory follows these guidelines. But something the housing sector has been concerned about is the pace of change that is brought into this. They say it doesn't give them enough time to invest in and update their own systems to meet a particular standard before they have to do it all over again and bring in a new set of standards. So a pause was a welcome breather for the industry. These things might seem like small tweaks, and in a way that they are. But again, one of the issues we need to remember here is improving this has to be a series of small tweaks to a whole range of things that certainly didn't end at the roundtable last month.
But Michael, isn't the big elephant in the room tax reform?
It is. Reforming the capital gains tax deduction on property investment would have a small effect on reducing property investor demand for housing and therefore lower some of the pricing pressure that we find in the market. Reforming stamp duty, which every economist says is the worst tax, would have an effect on increasing mobility because it would take away one of the big transaction taxes that stops people from selling their homes. If we're looking at big picture reforms, one of those is the idea of removing the capital gains tax exemption on the primary residence. This would be a major, major change because building up wealth tax-free through the family home is seen as a bedrock of the way that people look after themselves and build up wealth. If that were to be changed, it would be a big cultural change, but it would also trigger a lot of other issues that would need to be then considered. If wealth gain in the primary residence was seen to be taxable, what would that then mean for negative gearing? Could we then claim a negative gearing benefit against the gains that we've made to offset on our primary residence? Could it even mean we don't achieve what we want? Because if wealth gains in the primary residence are taxable, could that then become a hindrance to mobility in the way that stamp duty is seen to be? It's a big issue, but there's certainly a lot that we would need to discuss.
I don't think we should assume that the Labor government is going to have hands-off capital gains tax concession and negative gearing. I mean, when Bill Shorten retired last year and we were all asking him about those taxes that saw him lose the 2019 election, he said they were, had been rejected by the Australian people. They were ideas whose time hadn't come. It's possible that the housing crisis has now got so bad that those ideas would have a different reception this time. Because you don't have to abolish negative gearing. There are other softer options like capping the number of houses you can claim. It can be grandfathered so people who have the tax concession now can keep it, but in future people can't access it. You can limit it to new builds. So there's a lot of things that the federal government could do. And Anthony Albanese has never ruled it out, never said never ever. It's just that it's not policy now. I don't think we can rule out that they would do this after they've implemented some of their election policies later this term or take it to an election and do it next term.
So in the meantime, before we get those sorts of tax reforms or before we even think about them, Michael, what else can be done to bring down construction costs and get us closer to the target?
We know about labour shortages. Something like training apprentices and getting people into the vocational skills pipeline. It's not sexy and it's not exciting and it takes a lot of time, but it's something that we need to do to build up our own domestic capacity. And Don O'Rourke, who's a long-term developer in Brisbane, made the point that EBA conditions on his construction sites mean it's only viable for him to develop high-rise housing on one side of a street and not on the other. O'Rourke's argument was that because of the working conditions that push up costs for him, if he's building 2 apartment towers on a street, they cost the same on each side of the street, but he can only sell apartments on the riverfront side, which sell at a premium, because those are the only ones that will cover his costs and allow him to develop profitably. It's these EBA agreements that limit and govern how much time workers spend on site that are a key component of the costs for developers. Tackling EBAs is one thing, having a greater supply of skilled workers is another thing. Again, there are many issues that need to come into this to make construction cheaper.
So a final question for both of you then, to bring us back to what's happening in Woollahra. Does that very heated debate give us hope that politicians can make the hard decisions to boost housing supply? Or is it emblematic of the intractable problems involved in this crisis?
Well, Woollahra and Edgecliff in Sydney's inner east are in a seat held by, at the state level, Liberal MP Kelly Sloan, and at the federal level, a Teal Allegra Spender. So it's actually quite easy for New South Wales Labor to send the concrete trucks in there because they'll be getting all the cred for doing a big thing to solve the housing crisis, and none of the local blowback will really affect them. In fairness, they are doing infill and upzoning all around the city, but I think there's never been an easier time to send the concrete trucks in to ruin, a tree-lined street in East Sydney than it has now.
I think Woollahra and suburbs like it encapsulate all the problems of 21st century Australia in one small patch of dirt. We've got the conflicts of an ageing population and the need to bring in more people that we rely on to keep our economy going. We've got the challenge of widening access to opportunities that we all want. We've got the challenge of how to reduce the precariousness of being at the end of a railway line of global deliveries. We've got the challenge of managing migration to ensure we have enough skilled workers and how we educate and train the population we have at home. There's a lot in this, but if we can get it right in Woollahra and Brighton, we just might be able to do it more widely.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much, Lisa.
Thanks a lot, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Deputy Property Editor Michael Bleby and New South Wales political correspondent Paul Karp joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Mandy Coulin. Fiona Buffini is Head of Premium Content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.